I'm truly thrilled to have your attention, thrilled to have this opportunity to contemplate with you the nature of devotion. So thank you for coming and for bringing your attention and everything that I want to say today about devotion really revolves around a certain thought that was once captured very well by Saint Francis of Assisi, who said that the thing you are looking for is the one who is looking. And that idea reminds us that, every spiritual journey, any journey whatsoever, is only completed by coming back home, by coming back to the beginning, by coming back to the place where the journey started. Almost as if the thing that we are looking for in the journey is already there in the beginning, but for some reason we're not ready to receive it. We're not ready to recognize its presence there before us. And so we move out, we go away from home, we go out on a journey where we typically lose something. And in that loss, in that perhaps even in the affliction of a wound, and the experience of tending to that wound on the sort of later stages of the journey, and perhaps overcoming, some darkness or some demon that is sort of released through that wound, we find the ability to come back to the very thing that we were looking for. So I thought that maybe I would start this conversation with a little bit of story, a little bit of mythology from the Shiva cycle. And the piece of the Shiva cycle that I have in mind begins after the death of Sati. So Sati, you'll remember, was, at least in the Shiva cycle, Shiva's sort of, first dramatic, romantic, somewhat youthful relationship, right? And Sati was, I sometimes joke that Sati was like Shiva's teenage Gothic girlfriend, and because the whole relationship she's super intense. If you know how, she literally goes out in flames. So that their relationship is very short-lived, and what happens is that Sati, out of resentment, let's say out of apparent resentment toward her father. There's much, much more to the story. There are many dimensions of the story that we just don't have occasion to contemplate here. So I'm giving you just the very bare bones of it. Well, the story is that Sati goes down to a sacrificial ritual that her father is hosting, a ritual to fullness in which she and Shiva have been pointedly excluded. She goes down to this ritual and she throws herself into the sacrificial fire, okay? In a certain sense, completing the logic of this ritual which was a sort of sacrifice, of everything that Sati as the goddess actually represents, okay? Now, Shiva is profoundly distraught by this loss. He's profoundly distraught by the loss of this first dramatic, incendiary love. And so he goes through an intense period in which he retreats from the world. He goes wandering the countryside like a common mendicant, like a beggar. And his devotees don't even recognize him because he becomes so sort of sallow, so sullen, so emaciated, so sort of, outside himself that even his devotees don't recognize him. So he goes begging for alms in the front of his own temples, and he's disregarded by the people who, are bringing offerings of delicious food and so forth into the temple, to give to Shiva. There's Shiva, ironically, right outside the temple, begging for nourishment. And because these devotees don't recognize him, they sort of, step over him, in some instances even impatiently sort of, shooing him away so that they can go inside and, set these offerings in front of the altar, in front of the Shiva lingam. So Shiva just skulks off into the shadows, and he has a number of misadventures there. And he eventually, his suffering, his grief, because he's really in this phase of the story, Shiva is wallowing in grief. It becomes unbearable to him so much that he can't even bear to sort of feel his own body. Okay? So he goes off into the mountains and he uses his meditation to make himself numb. He retreats into the inner space of his consciousness so that he kind of loses all sense of the body and, well, he just checks out. Okay? And during the time that Shiva is checked out, the worlds start to go out of balance again, right? And so the devas go to the goddess and they beg her to incarnate into the world once again, to take another form and to once again, as Sati did, seduce Shiva out of his meditative self-absorption so that he can be creatively involved in the world and so that there can once again be the kind of sort of reflective self-knowledge that only comes about when the two principles of consciousness and creative energy that Shiva and Shakti represent are sort of in a state of intimacy with each other and in a state of recognition. Okay. So the goddess agrees, as she did before, to incarnate into the world in another form. This time she comes into the world as the daughter of the mountain. And so she's called Parvati, the daughter of the mountain. And she begins, just as Sati did before her, to be haunted in her dreams by this mysterious figure who has long, matted hair and whose body is covered with ashes and who wears nothing, but a tattered tiger hide for a loincloth, and who has a trident and who has a garland of skulls around his neck. And she sees this figure in her dreams from a very young age. In the beginning, she doesn't know who he is, but she's haunted by him through and through, and very much sort of drawn in her waking life to try and understand who he is and to get closer to him. Okay? So she, unlike Sati before her, has a very sort of sympathetic father. So her father, Himavan, is a great devotee of Shiva. Okay, so a rishi comes to visit their kingdom and does some palmistry, so does a palm reading on the hand of Parvati, and his suspicions are confirmed. As he sees the lines on her hands, he realizes who she is and realizes that she is an incarnation of the goddess and that she's come to the earth, or not to the earth, but rather to Deva Loka. She's come onto that plane of embodiment in order to draw Shiva out, to sort of entangle with him into an erotic intimacy, and to bring consciousness into reflective awareness of itself once again, so that there's once again that kind of balance and harmony between the basic elements of reality that Shiva and Shakti represent. Okay, so he whispers into her ear the 5-syllable mantra Om Namah Shivaya that she is that will resonate through her consciousness for the rest of her life, but especially through the rest of an intense period of bhakti ritual that she undergoes in order to start to draw Shiva toward her. Okay? So she starts to chant this 5-syllable mantra, and she also starts to go out into the woods, just as Sati did before, and perform bhakti rituals to her beloved. And through these rituals, she is, in a certain way, calling him toward her. Okay? So she lights fires, she dances around the fire, she chants this mantra, she sings other songs to her beloved. She lights incense, she makes tea, she makes various offerings of her thoughts, of her feelings to the image that she has in her mind of Shiva. And Shiva, who, of course, has sort of retreated, into solitude, hears these calls. He hears them, he feels certain stirrings in his heart. Okay. And for reasons that he doesn't fully understand, he's drawn out, at least momentarily, of his meditative self-absorption one fine morning, and impelled to sort of move his retreat, to move his little ashram, to take up refuge somewhere else. So he goes wandering through the mountains toward the higher peaks of the Himalaya, toward the kingdom of Parvati's father. He wanders across long snowy ridges with his entourage of ganas trailing behind him, with on the back of Nandan, his big white bull. And he comes to a place that, unbeknownst to him, is very close to the home and the kingdom of Parvati and her family. And he takes up his home there. He finds another cave. He goes into the cave and he starts to meditate once again. Okay. Some of the people of the kingdom who keep watch, some of Parvati's father's people, see footprints in the snow leading up to this cave, and they see Nand and the white bull outside the cave, and they go back and they report to Parvati's father, the king, and tell him that there's a visitor, and they describe the white bull and describe what they've seen, and Parvati's father is ecstatic. Yeah? And he tells all of his people that they are not to go anywhere near the mouth of that cave. And he makes an official decree to all his people forbidding them to go up to the cave. He doesn't tell them who's there. Instead, he tells them all that, a certain rishi has come to perform some rituals for the benefit of the kingdom, and that he and his entourage are not to be disturbed. So he forbids people from going anywhere near that cave, but as he does so, he makes a little wink to his daughter Parvati, right? Hoping that she will indeed go and perhaps meet Shiva, who they all understand because of that palm reading is, in a sense, her dharma, her destiny in this life to intertwine with him. Okay. So now something's happening in the background, which is that Indra, who, while the universe has gone out of balance, while Shiva has been wallowing in his grief, while Shiva has been sort of turned in on himself and sort of lost in the interior of his own consciousness and not fully aware, because Shiva is having a dark moment in this story. That's the point, is that he's not fully aware, precisely because he's in a certain moment of what's called tirodhana, which means forgetting. Okay? He's not in the moment of recognition, he's in the moment of forgetting. And in the moment of forgetting, as I said, the universe has gone out of balance, and a certain demon called Taraka is just tyrannizing Devaloka, and he's ousted Indra from his throne and even stolen the throne itself. So Taraka has sort of, taken over, and Indra has been fully displaced, and he has gone to, he's asked for the help of Kama, okay? Now, Kama is an archer. Kama is the Greek cousin, the Indian cousin of Eros, okay? Eros is Kama's Greek cousin. They're both archers. They both shoot arrows into the hearts of unsuspecting beings, making them fall madly and instantly in love with whoever they encounter, whoever they behold. Okay. So Indra, as the most powerful of the gods, at least in this moment, right, calls upon Kama to come and see him, right? And Kama, because of his nature, is super arrogant, okay? So Kama comes flying in riding on the back of a peacock, which is his vehicle, and, lands there where Indra is, and, comes strutting up toward Indra. And Indra offers Kama his, sort of makeshift throne, his sort of surrogate throne. Now, Indra could destroy Kama in an instant with a single throw of one of his lightning bolts. Okay? Indra's kind of like, his Greek cousin is Zeus. Huh? They both throw lightning bolts and sort of, preside in a certain way over the other gods. But Indra can't do without Kama, and Kama knows that, because Kama is sort of the ruler of the most powerful force that there is, right? And the most precious resource. for the seeker, which is desire, which is what kama means, right? By controlling desire, kama can change the course of history, right? By the simple shifts of attention that are possible through a redirection of desire completely change the flow of the unfoldment of reality, right? And Indra, knowing that kama rules over that power, can't do without him. So although kama knows that Indra could totally destroy him, he happily takes that seat on Indra's throne. He just hops himself right up there and says, "What can I do for you?" to Indra, okay? And so Indra starts to remind kama, in order to sort of, stroke kama's really rather swollen ego. He starts to recount some of kama's various exploits, reminding kama of all of the extraordinary conquests that he's made with his arrows, all of the various rishis whose hearts he's captured, and other very powerful divine beings that he's captured with the arrows of desire, and the various ways that he's changed the course of things by making just the right people fall in love with just the right other people at just the right time, or beings, I should say. So kama, who's sort of brimming over with arrogance now, is nodding his head and thinking of all of these various conquests. And then Indra says, so you've done, kama, you've done all of these extraordinary things, but there's one thing that I wonder if you can do. And kama, of course, gives him his ear, and he says, can you seduce Shiva? Right? And kama's smile spreads very wide, right? And he says, yes, this is something that I think I can do, right? And so Indra is telling kama that the goddess, as Parvati, is soon going to meet Shiva for the first time, right? And would kama please be present at that scene in order to work his magic, right? So kama agrees to do this thing. Right? So now, Parvati, the next day after her father lets her know that Shiva is just on the edges of their kingdom, right? Rises early, dresses in her finest silks, takes some offerings, some sweets, because Shiva's into sweets, and starts up the mountain by herself, or so she thinks. And as she's walking up the mountain, which is, of course, it's the Himalaya, they're high in the mountains, and the mountains are, they are expecting them to be covered in snow, right? And it's like late winter, okay? So she's expecting everything to be covered in snow and ice. But as she's walking up the mountain, she keeps feeling this warm breeze, and the mountain itself keeps greening, right? To her astonishment. That is, a wave of springtime is washing up the mountain as she's walking. And so as she's ascending onto what should be icy, snowy peaks, all of the snow and the ice is melting. And almost instantaneously, new life is pressing up from the soil of the earth. Tender shoots are reaching up. Flowers are blooming. Cuckoos are flying through the air. Bees are buzzing all around, right? And she understands that there's some supernatural powers at work, but she knows not what. She continues all the way up to the place where Shiva's taken up his little ashram. And she sees the white bull outside mouth of the cave. The white bull opens a single eye and sees her, and then closes it again and pretends that he's asleep. And she goes ahead and walks past Nandan into the mouth of the cave. And there, she sees the figure of her dreams. She sees, for the first time in this incarnation, Shiva. So she sits down before Shiva, and she goes into meditative consciousness, the very consciousness that Shiva is. She's had no formal training, but as the goddess, she has the intelligence of yoga inside of her. She is that intelligence. She is the sort of Jesta current, the current that draws toward the center of Shivaic consciousness. And so she's immediately magnetized and drawn deep into his center. So she feels herself moving into his abyss as she's sitting before him. She doesn't really, in that abyss, there's no up, there's no down, there's no directionality. And so she feels herself just sort of floating freely in that emptiness. And she knows not sort of where to look or where to go. But she continues to move as she endlessly does through that space. And in good time, she comes upon a light far off. She sees a warm light far in the distance, but at some immeasurable distance. And so she starts to move toward it. But she has the distinctive sense that the closer she moves toward it, the more it sort of draws back. But she continues to move, and she feels sometimes as if she's getting closer to it, almost like it's allowing her to get closer to it, but then it moves again. And she feels this sense that it's sort of, not just that it's moving, but that it's intentionally withdrawing from her, right? Now Shiva, for his part, is wondering, who could this possibly be coming toward me in the innermost depths of this abyssal space, where only I am? And he's intrigued. And so he keeps pausing and allowing this feminine presence to come closer to him, But remember that he's still wounded. He's still licking his wound, right? He hasn't overcome that wound, right? And this is the sort of tragic and dark moment of his journey, right? This story of, moving away. He's in the farthest place of his journey in this very moment. But you can also imagine that he's he's kind of like, someone who's been wounded in a relationship, right? And then has an encounter where the heart is sort of trembling, right? With intrigue, with warmth. And then is drawing back out of a sense of wanting to protect itself, right? Like, I just got out of a really hard relationship. I don't want any trouble. So he's backpedaling in that way, right? But he's also intrigued and really actually somewhat astonished that this being keeps coming toward him. So he pauses, he lets it get closer and closer, and then he allows the heat of his tapas to radiate outward, which is an intense, infernal heat. And Sati, right, as the goddess, is the only one who can fully withstand that power, who can sort of, hold herself in those flames. And so she just abides in the heat. And now Shiva's completely beside himself, and he's getting nervous. He's a little afraid, whoa. So he waits again for her to get super close, and he allows his infernal heat to just roar out of him with such intensity that it would scorch any other being. But she remains. And she, for her part, is, a bit vexed at the fact that he's sort of running away from her and then, breathing fire at her in this way. But she stays nonetheless because she feels drawn to that inner space. Now, when Shiva notices that this feminine presence is so close to his center, he feels sort of a moment of panic and then a trembling in his heart, a sort of quaking. And he opens his eyes and he sees this beautiful young woman that he does not yet recognize sitting before him. In this warm space of his cave. And just over his shoulder, there's an archer. And the archer has just drawn an arrow, right? And it's Kama, of course. And he lets the arrow go, and it shoots over Parvati's shoulder right toward Shiva. Shiva opens his third eye and scorches the arrow and the archer with one blast of his tapas. Parvati hears a scream, the scream of a woman outside her cave. She doesn't know who that is, right? And she turns and she sees a heap of ashes behind her. It's the body of Kama. Right? And then Shiva closes his eyes and plunges back in himself, right? And Parvati, right, who's completely confused now, and a bit sort of disturbed by the whole scene, just quickly collects her things and gets up and she goes home. Okay. She collects herself. The next morning she goes up again and Shiva is gone. Right? So, the scream outside the cave was the scream of Rati. That's Kama's consort. Rati means pleasure, right? And without desire, pleasure has no role. It has no place. So this is not, ecstatic bliss. This is the pleasure that comes from the fulfillment of desire. That's what Rati is, right? And you can hear Rati's name inflected, as the sort of, the sort of Indic root, you might say, of the word erotic. Right? And yoga, hatha yoga, is sometimes referred to as the perfection of the erotic, right? And it's the perfection of the erotic not because it sort of empowers you to secure the objects of your desires and then to sort of, reap the pleasures that come from that kind of fulfillment, right? Not at all. But it's called the perfection of the erotic because, as I was describing for you in more detail in the last talk, the movement of hatha yoga is a movement of desire in which the energy of desire is released from its object, right? And when desire is released from its object, it often moves, as we talked last time, say, to higher and higher spheres of consciousness, where it may, after all, become entangled again and then directed toward different objects. But it may be, as in the sort of story that we contemplated last time, that is the story about the ascent of the soul on the vehicle of Eros, or now we can say of Kama, right? That was described in Plato's Symposium, as you remember. But that at the very higher reaches of that process, there is a surrendering of the object of desire, right? So that the energy that's contained within desire, the erotic energy, the energy of Eros, is liberated from any object whatsoever and pervades the atmosphere of consciousness as pure, selfless love. Right? Eros, liberated from its object. Kama, desire, liberated from its object. Now, this moment when Shiva scorches Kama, sometimes called, in the mythology, it's referred to just as the burning of Kama, right? The burning of the rupam of desire, the form of desire, is what that moment in the mythology represents. Because what happens in this moment is not that Kama is not obliterated. He's disembodied. He pervades the atmosphere, right? And later in the story, when Parvati and Shiva meet again, right, which is another, amazing, riveting, intriguing episode that I don't have time to recount for you here. But when they meet again and they reunite, they do so on radically different terms. That is, on radically different terms than the terms under which Sati and Shiva united. Okay? So just to remind you back from the first talk, when Sati and Shiva got together, Sati's father, Daksha, who represents the religious mind, right? The idolatrous mind, the mind that projects a particular idea of the longing of the heart, and then tries to mediate through the mechanisms of egocentric control the space and the distance between itself, or what it thinks of as itself, its self-idea, and that object. Okay, that's what Daksha represents. But, as I said, Parvati's father is actually a devotee of Shiva, right? So whereas Daksha was scandalized and outraged when Sati and Shiva got together, and that whole thing is just overflowing with meaning. We talk about it some other time. Parvati's father, Himavan, is overjoyed that Shiva and his daughter are uniting. And through a certain kind of ruse, a sort of loving, almost comic tease, Parvati demands that Shiva ask her father for her hand in marriage, which, by the way, commits him to a super elaborate, ceremonious, multi-day, massive wedding with, in full regalia. Okay. Now remember that Shiva represents a sort of, everything that doesn't fit comfortably inside of the presiding scheme of organization and the sort of shadow of all of the religious objects. He represents everything that the religious consciousness leaves out, right? Leaves out of its projection of the absolute. And so mythologically, his sort of character is he likes to stay out on the margins. He doesn't go inside temples. He doesn't go to elaborate religious rituals, and he sure as hell doesn't get all dressed up for a wedding. Okay? He prefers to smear the ashes on his body, smoke the chillum, and stay out sort of on the very edges and margins of society with marginal beings, right? So his reuniting with Parvati represents a big shift in consciousness, right? And it's a shift in which something very different happens when Shiva comes down the mountain. Okay? And in the mythology, the mountain is always a sort of, among other things, the mountain represents the center of the subtle body, right? You think of like the myth of churning the cosmic ocean when they put Meru, which is another name in the twilight language of Hatha Yoga, another name for the central axis, or even the spine. Sometimes that's the spine, right? And then they churn it, which is a metaphor for practice in order to get the Amrita to rise, right? Well, Shiva and Shakti meet, in the sort of esoteric subtle body descriptions of Hatha Yoga. It's that the rising Kundalini energy meets with her beloved in the cranial vault, right? This is the abode of Shiva in the head, right? And then if all goes well, the nectar rains down, right? Because as I said last time, Hatha Yoga is about this dual movement of transcendence and of eminence, right? Of being lifted out of ordinary consciousness and touching the absolute elements of reality, but then coming back down the mountain into a place of embodiment and re-experiencing that place as being utterly sacred and utterly enchanted, precisely because it's seen as a reflection of something divine, right? Now, when Sati went down to the mountain, everything burned up, right? She went down the mountain, and there was what happened when she went down the mountain was destruction, a destruction of the religious mind, and then the dark night of the soul, represented by Shiva's grief, right? The dark night of the soul, that phrase refers to, a work by St. John of the Cross, and what he's talking about with that phrase is a moment that comes after an experience of intimacy with God, an experience of intimacy with the infinite, with the absolute, in which suddenly the soul, the individual soul, feels estranged from that, right? As if the divine has departed, as if the divine has left the phenomenal realm and left the soul alone and left it to go wandering, right, in grief, as Shiva does. Sort of pining for the beloved, right? So what needs to happen before Shiva can recognize that this beautiful being before him, Parvati, just is his beloved, but in another form, is that he has to burn the idol or burn the image that he's formed of his beloved, and that in his mind, he's reduced her to. He has to burn that image so that his desire is no longer channeled toward a particular form, but is allowed to move toward formlessness itself and pervade the atmosphere of consciousness. When that happens, he can recognize who Parvati is, fall in love with her all over again, and do so on completely different terms, indeed on terms that allow him to embrace the limited world of form with all of its signs and its symbols and its images, and to understand that phenomenal world as the scene in which intimacy with the deepest elements of reality is possible. And the scene in which the glory of the creative principle, the beauty and the sublimity of it all can be fully appreciated, can be touched, tasted, heard, right? And then that's what allows this sort of second rising of Kundalini, which is what's represented by the life of Parvati, right, to become, to be complete, right? And so the completion of Shiva's journey is the rediscovery of what he lost as being something that's right before his eyes, and that, in fact, he was never alienated from in the first place. Because even when he was wallowing in his grief, the grief itself, as a phenomenal experience, is an emanation of Shakti. It's just that he couldn't see that while wallowing in his grief. Okay? Now it's said in the Yoga Sutra, in Sutra 217, that the cause of suffering is the samyoga, the equivocation of the seer and the seen, right? And what that means is that the equivocation between the seer and the seen is the fundamental mistake of this Purusha, of this individual splinter of consciousness. The mistake of supposing that what I am is some entity in my phenomenal experience. In other words, to mistake myself for something seen, to mistake myself for something that's in front of me, like the image that my mind keeps projecting of who I am, right? The image that others project of who I am when they speak to me, right? That is the fundamental, let's say, distraction according to yoga. How do we overcome that distraction? we overcome that distraction by, well, let's say, by exercising our intelligence, our deeper intelligence. It's what Patanjali calls viveka kyatahi, discriminating awareness, right? To see that just as that we cannot be reduced to any of the objects of our experience, to any cluster of images, to any cluster of ideas, nor can any other human being, right? And in fact, that's what it means when we say that human beings have depth. When we say that human beings have infinite depth, we remind ourselves, right, that human beings partake of the nature of the divine, which is endlessly expressing its creative nature through an unceasing proliferation of forms, right? So in other words, that, let's say it this way, that Shakti herself is always sort of in the process of showing herself to be more than than we ever thought that she was, right? By manifesting in ever new forms. And the nature of our own experience reveals that. Our reflections on the biological world reveal that. Our reflections on history reveal that. That even if there are certain patterns that repeat itself, there's also in every moment a sense of something utterly new, something entirely fresh, revealing something that has never been before and never will be again. And that movement reminds us that we cannot be reduced to any of the sort of, limited or finite images that we might have of ourselves. And so it shows us that what we are is not some sort of, finite, limited object in the world. Although we have part of our being is sort of extended into the finite world, like the body itself, with all of its inherent limitation and so forth, right? But that the very essence of who we are can't be reduced to that, right? And somehow we know this, but, okay, and this is what I would like you to contemplate this, that it's said, and it says also in the Yoga Sutra, that Prakriti and Purusha, or let's say Shiva and Sakti, right? They intertwine in order to to fully realize the intrinsic nature of each. Okay? So consciousness can only come to full self-awareness by contemplating the spontaneous unfoldment of its own creative potential. And that spontaneous unfoldment is animated by and held by the space of consciousness itself, right? And actually those two principles then cannot be what they are without each other, right? And they're actually just two different dimensions of the same thing. But human life, as this story reminds us, is full of loss and heartache and grief and suffering. And it's said that the suffering is there to remind us and to show us, just as Sati showed her father and showed Shiva, that what she really is, which is the inherent power that's the creative power that's inherent to consciousness itself, can never be reduced to any particular finite image, that it's always more than what is revealed, And so to show you, then what the teaching then is that all of the heartache and suffering of this world is meant to wake us up, to show us that the images that we have, the reductive images that we have of ourselves, involve this equivocation that is, as Patanjali reminds us, the very source of our suffering. To remind us that if we look deeper within ourselves, if we set aside all of our thoughts and our emotions, if we set aside all of our memories, if we set aside all of the various habits and patterns of thought that sustain our sort of, living sense of ourselves, our socially conditioned and emotionally conditioned sense of ourselves, if we set all that aside and we look into the emptiness, we find a sense of being that is beyond injury. Something that is untouched by fear, that knows no anxiety. Something that was not created, something that cannot be destroyed. And that when we rest our attention down into that, into the ground of our being, which is always there, which we don't need any fancy yogic techniques or rituals or visualizations or any great efforts at all to evoke, because it's always already there. It's always at home. It's the place from which we begin our journey. And it is indeed the power of seeing that witnesses the journey itself. And its timeless presence is our own presence. So when Sati threw herself on the fire and burned herself up, it was for the sake of showing Shiva and her religious father that she cannot be reduced to any particular image of who she is, and that their images even of themselves and of who they are was involved in this same confused equivocation, this samyoga, right? It was a way of wresting those self-images away from them, right? So that they could come back to themselves, right? So what seemed like a gesture of resentment and anger in the first place is shown later in this story, right, to be an act of love. To be an act that allows Shiva to sort of go on this journey where he has to sort of shift through all of these things in himself and to sort of peer into his own wounds, right? And feel the pain, feel the suffering, feel the agony, right? Precisely so that he can eventually come back to himself, back to the beginning, right? Back to his beloved, and see the world with fresh eyes, recognize the enchantment of this reality all over again, right? But of course, that movement, that recognition involves the offering of the mind the offering of thought and emotion onto the altar of that deeper consciousness where it's allowed to dissolve back into the ground. And when we touch down into that timeless presence, that is the power of seeing that's giving us our sentience in this very moment, our hearts fill with warmth. Our hearts fill with the energy of Eros released from its object. They fill with love. They fill with compassion. And that's the raining of the nectar. And so devotion is the relentless, unwavering movement of attention again and again back into that ground, back into that timeless place of seeing that's always with you. It's the movement back home continuously, right? Out of the place of distraction, out of the place of anxiety, out of the place even of excitement, back to the place of home. And that is the movement then of the deeper movement of life itself. I think I'll stop there. And